Hello and welcome to the first video of DP Cinema Talk. Today I'd like to talk about the advantages and disadvantages, or pros and cons if you will, of aspect ratio choices, namely 235 to 1 versus 185 to 1, or in other words 16 by 9. So with 235 to 1, what are some of the advantages? Well, the most distinct advantage that I can think of, as long as you're not shooting in scope or anamorphic, is you get the top and bottom of your frame chopped off. Now, this may initially seem like a bad thing, but usually the goal of film is not to cram as much detail into each shot as possible, and I'd like to go into depth into that discussion in another video at a later stage. But for now, suffice to say that the top and bottom portions of the image being recorded affords more editing options in post as far as framing goes. And I'll illustrate that with some examples right now. So let's say that you have a simple shot. Let's start with a simple shot where the character in focus, stands up, sits down, or generally does something that requires a camera adjustment, usually through a pan via fluid head or similar. So since we want to frame the subject in most cases the conventional way via the eye line, just simply an imaginary line approximately 2/3 of the way up the top of the image, unless there is another reason not to. It's not a hard and fast rule. It arguably makes for a more pleasing frame to the viewer, making them less aware or less conscious that they are watching a film. And so the camera hopefully fades away into the ether, and the audience just gets caught up in what's going on in front of them. So in that sense, even with these fundamental filming basics, following your characters properly and framing them properly can really help ease the audience into each shot and getting the audience comfortable with the shots. Now, if your film is being cropped down from 16 by 9 to 235, then you have additional framing options in post to tweak the eye line, among other things, and get it just right. In fact, in general, if you have the luxury of shooting with a high-res sensor, say 4K and above, and I think it may be worth pulling the camera back, or if you prefer, using a slightly wider lens and tighten those shots in post. Now, you may be instantly thinking, uh-oh, we're losing resolution, and if you were shooting directly in 1080p and your output is 1080p, then you definitely have to consider that as an immediate issue. But if your acquisition resolution is way above your final output resolution, then you could end up with a much better end result, I think, allowing yourself that freedom with your editor in post. Another advantage that could be argued in several ways is how you compose your shot and how that translates from the screen to your audience in subtle ways. So apart from the framing advantage above and below, you have the advantage to frame the actual subjects differently in 235 as opposed to 16 by 9. Take the MCU, or medium close. I will just say medium close. This is where we have the subject in frame up to shoulder height. So we see their shoulders, we see their face, maybe the top of their head is out of frame, depends on how far we are and lens selection, but usually that is what we have in frame. You can frame one subject in medium close at 16 by 9 comfortably. Fantastic if you have lots of dialogue on single characters, shooting over the shoulder with a bit of dirt, great for locked reverse shots. You have two characters facing each other in a diner. That shot begs for medium close on both characters, and you can comfortably frame that at 235, and you won't get their legs under the table, yet your frame would still give them enough distance that the audience doesn't feel uncomfortably close, and we're also cutting off needless information like the ceiling of the diner, and we don't need to see what's under the table again. Which is just distracting information. So now, if you have an eye shot, is simply two characters side by side, unless you want them almost rubbing shoulders. You need to pull back to a mid shot on each one to get them comfortably in frame at 16 by 9. And when I say comfortably, I mean you would want their faces in 4x3 in the 4x3 zone. And this has nothing to do with cinematography at this point, and everything to do with considerations for the distribution of your film. How does this shot look with a 16 by 9 crop? Are we chopping off characters if this is shown on TV? Unfortunately, even though we have this wide vista-like frame in 235, often it's going to be underutilized simply for the fact that in many cases you want the film to be viewable at 16 by 9 for various reasons. So 235 is also considered to be far more cinematic than 16 by 9, and I'm going to hazard a guess and say that this is because being earthbound creatures, we have this thing in the distance of our frame known as the horizon line, and it's a horizontal line where the sky and the ground converge. And I mean, there is no quote unquote Verizon line or a vertical equivalent. I mean, I just made that word up, obviously. So 235 allows you to frame something epic. It could be soldiers running, horses, ships, cars, a city, a landscape in the distance. And it not only emphasizes the scale by the fact that the horizon takes up such an enormous enveloping streak across the screen, but as you move away from the horizon in the vertical direction up towards the top and the bottom edge of the frame, you are, especially in the lower part of the frame, by implication, getting closer and closer to the camera. Since the ground is obviously going to be closer to the camera to the point that if you did have optical coverage and you were able to see lower and lower, you'd eventually be staring at the camera tripod on the ground point blank. And 235 allows us to frame the scene, so we are distancing our audience from the action. The ground immediately in front of the audience can be framed completely out of view, so the visual reference points as far as the viewer is concerned is quite far. It's going to be further than in a 16 by 9 frame, where you've got more vertical space. So to get the same effect, if you were shooting in 16 by 9, you'd probably have to frame the horizon line along the lower third to get a similar effect. The final thing about 235, I know I'm harping on about 235. This is definitely the last point I'll make, and that is with the XCU or extreme close-up at 235, you can push the camera in so close that you simply have the subject's eyes covering the entire frame. That's it. There's nothing more in your face, it's quite literally in your face when you're watching this as a viewer. Used at pivotal moments in a film can be very, very expressive and can help greatly with assisting the audience to take in what is happening to the character on the screen and emphasize whatever emotion they are experiencing. So let's move on to 185 to 1. Or since they are so close to each other, I'll just refer to this aspect ratio as 16 by 9. So what are some of the advantages? Well, most screens will be 16 by 9. So you are maximizing the viewing area of the viewer's display. So that's the final end. Now at the acquisition end, most camera sensors are at 16 by 9 for video. So thus you're maximizing the sensor input data. So if your goal is to produce the most detailed, most crisp image, so let's say you're shooting a documentary or you're shooting sports, then this is probably the best way to go. So let's say your goal is to produce something cinematic. If you're on top of your game, 185 or 16 by 9 can be breathtakingly cinematic. Just as an example, Steven Spielberg has shot most of his films in 185 to 1. Jurassic Park, Saving Private Ryan, even James Cameron, when he made Aliens, as opposed to Ridley Scott's Alien, which was in 235. Aliens, if you go back and look, that is actually in 185 to 1. And it is epic. Aliens was an epic tour de force. If you want to shoot in 16 by 9 and create something epic, you can. It might be a little more difficult, but in by no means diminishes the ability of 16 by 9 to produce something fantastic. So that's it. Those are all the reasons I could come up with. If you have any other points that you have thought of during this talk, maybe you've found something interesting about either aspect ratio that I've missed. I've probably missed many things, but if you've got some valuable piece of information you'd like to share, please share it with us in the comments. Please rate this video if you like it, and subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching.